One of my ongoing struggles and one of my most asked questions is how to create looser, more expressive brushwork while still maintaining realism in our paintings. So today I'm sharing 7 steps that I use to develop looseness in my own work that I hope you'll be able to use in yours. Diving right in, step 1 is painting from life. Overwhelmingly, I found that it's easy to paint way too tight when I'm working from in-focus photographs. Cameras don't simply work the way our eyes do. We don't actually focus on a single point naturally. Even when we're only intending to look at that point, we also have binocular vision that our cameras lack. As a result, the most naturalistic paintings I've found have points of focus that don't function as a camera lens would. The focus will jump around and have a variety of edges. Compare that instead to a photo taken with, say, a portrait lens. Your subject may be in focus, but the background is uniformly blurred. And the farther away from the subject you go, the more intense the blur becomes. The edges become remarkably uniform for any object in a given plane. I also find that I get really concerned with my drawing when I work from photos, and I stop working efficiently as a result. I focus on just getting everything precise down to the millimeter instead of getting the impression correct and then moving on. I find that this really impacts my edges as well as overall looseness because edges are generally how we check that our drawing is accurate, so we tend to keep them tight. So even if you have a lot of experience, if you're hoping to paint more loosely, this is absolutely the number one tip I can offer, and what I would absolutely start with. Even if you have a painting you want to create loose brushwork, but it has to be from a photo, practicing painting from life as a warm-up or preparation can really go a long way. My second step is to stand back. The advice I routinely hear is to position your easel so that you can easily back up 8 feet to assess your painting. This could be a longer distance with larger paintings, but for most work, 8 feet seems to be the consensus. The next step here is to make all of your decisions from this distance. Don't just back up, look at the painting, walk back up to the painting, and decide where you want to put down your next stroke. Deciding it from 8 feet back helps you to 1, be more thoughtful about every brush stroke since you have to literally step back after every stroke, and 2, focus less on small details and edges that you won't see from that distance. It is exceptionally hard, I think, to stay really tight if you actually are putting this into practice. I found, though, with my students that it's very easy to hear this advice and then disregard it. Like, they can stand back, make a decision, and then work up close in front of the painting for half an hour before remembering to back up again. Now, there aren't painting police that anyone is going to call, and plenty of artists do work up close to their paintings for long stretches. But if you're worried about the painting feeling tight, I try to really be conscientious of this habit and shift to backing up on a stroke-by-stroke basis. If you need to, put a big sticky note on your easel that says back up. Step 3 is practicing good posture, specifically as it relates to how you hold your brushes. This step relates to specifically how you're putting down marks. Ideally, you want to be using long handle brushes that you hold at the very end of the brush handle. You want your easel to be positioned so that it's at shoulder height and you work standing up fully straight with your arm fully extended. This means that even when you make marks, you're at a distance away from your canvas that equals the full length of your brush plus the full length of your arm. This is going to let you take in the canvas as a whole rather than zeroing in on the tiny place where your brush mark is about to go. Conversely, what you probably don't want to do is lean right up to your canvas, hold your brush like it's a pencil, and make teeny tiny marks. But as I said earlier, some artists do work up close to their paintings. For instance, Daniel Keyes once remarked that he started working sitting in a chair instead of standing because with a non-rolling chair, he could force himself to stay a certain distance back. Whereas when he stood, he could just walk right up and get right on top of the canvas and work way too close to it. So if you need to sit or you find that you are likely to come right up to the canvas when standing, instead of keeping a distance of a few feet between you and the painting, this could be a really helpful strategy. Next up is step 4, which is to count your brush strokes. Okay, now we're getting into the next level of strategies. I think most of loose painting comes from your setup, but now we're getting into tips that are more about painting itself beyond that setup. Oftentimes, people think about loose brushwork as being super spontaneous, where the artist just turns their mind off and lets the muses guide them to bring more energy into the painting. The reality could not be further from the truth. Painters like Richard Schmid or Daniel Keyes, who have beautiful brushwork, are incredibly deliberate about every mark, considering how each one will contribute to the composition. This means that they do not put down a single brushstroke more than is necessary. So if you find yourself fussing over strokes or using 15 brushstrokes where one would do, this step is for you. Richard Schmid calls this compulsive touching of the canvas with the brush licking, but I prefer to call it petting. Just like we mindlessly pet our animals to bring us a sense of peace or calm. I don't know anyone who compulsively licks things, but I definitely know that all of us can get kind of lost in our own thoughts when petting a cute, soft animal. So that's just how I'm going to refer to it. Petting to me means putting down a brush stroke and then repeating the stroke over and over, usually to perfect it, or maybe to blend it into the strokes around it, or blend the new stroke of paint into the paint that's beneath it. Most often, though, it doesn't serve a purpose other than giving our brains a break from the highly focused and mentally taxing process of painting. If you think this might be you, challenge yourself to count your brushstrokes. Look at a shape and ask how one brushstroke could convey the entire shape on your canvas. The more you do this, the more efficient, effective, and ultimately expressive your painting is going to become. Next up is step 5, which is to mix more paint. One thing I see from a lot of beginning and intermediate painters is to 1, put out too little paint on their palette, 2, mix too little paint, and then 3, rely on a really stiff brush because nothing else is capable of spreading that little amount of paint across the canvas. So to help combat this, start by putting out generous piles of paint. You might use less of a phthalo or a cadmium, but I would still challenge you to lay out inch-long strips of paint rather than teeny tiny daubs. I don't struggle with putting out enough paint, but I do struggle with picking up far too little paint out of those piles when I'm mixing. So if you feel like this is you, I'd encourage you to mix with a palette knife so you almost have a whole new pile of paint for the color you're mixing. That is, by the time you've mixed them together. If my paint looks really flat or thin across my palette, it's usually too little for me to wind up making interesting brushwork. Interesting brushwork tends to require more paint. Just as a disclaimer, this doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be a really thick application of paint, but as a rule, for painters who are going for realism, I tend to find that the paintings are really, really thin. And you definitely don't want to go too thick too fast with your paint application, but I would just ask yourself, do I think that maybe my paintings could be too thin? Do I struggle with getting paint to spread across the canvas? Or do I often find myself reaching for really, really stiff brushes to do the heavy lifting? And if so, it might mean that you could stand to have more paint in your mixtures. And this goes right into step 6, which is to use the right brushes. I have this as step 6 because I don't think it's necessary to have the right brush to make a beautiful painting, but I do think that being conscientious here can be really helpful. I don't want you to necessarily run out and go buy new brushes, but on the other hand, I think there are some important points to make here. So on the note of mixing enough paint, picking brushes that require more paint and don't let you scrub too small amounts of paint into the canvas can really be a boon. Let me kind of explain what I mean by that. For juicy brushwork, I really like the Eclipse Extra Long Combers from Rosemary & Company. I'll include a link to them in the bio, or description, I should say, and I have multiple brushes in every size for this brush. And the reason is that these brushes are meant to simulate older brushes with more character, but they're also super soft. So you tend to lay down paint rather than being able to push paint around. Now, different brushes have different uses and strengths for creating interesting brushwork. I like bristles for initial washes as they can help me create interesting marks with really thin paint. Sometimes it's helpful to have super new brushes for crisp lines and more control, and other times it's great to have old brushes that have been really abused to make marks with more character. But above all else, I'd evaluate what habits your current brushes are encouraging in you. When I switched from harder brushes, stiffer brushes, to softer brushes that I couldn't force to do what I wanted, I learned a great deal about how to better make marks and break my bad habits around mixing too little paint and trying to blend paint on the canvas. Now I can use those same stiff bristle brushes lightly and to good effect, but taking a break from them really made a big difference for me. And finally, we come to step 7, which is to pick the right subject. So finally, I've noticed that this last tip makes a really big difference for me personally. I find it much easier, for instance, to be loose when painting flowers than I am when painting a portrait commission. Rather than trying to force myself to try a new approach in a piece for a client, I try to set myself up for success by choosing subjects that are easier for me to approach more loosely when I want to work on that aspect of my painting. And of course, as a part of this, I also emphasize working from life rather than photos. So typically for portrait commissions, I have to work from photos, whereas when painting flowers, I'm probably going to just set up a still life rather than doing like a flower photo shoot or something. I suspect which subjects lend themselves to looseness vary from person to person, but I'd encourage you to do some exploration of your own work and your own habits to see what works for you. I found that when I make time for looser paintings, they help my work no matter the subject. So, for example, even when I want to loosen up a portrait, deliberately going and working on a still life can translate back to that portrait work. I imagine other considerations like size of the painting can also make a difference here, so just take notes and observe which paintings were easier for you to paint more loosely, and ask yourself what about those pieces you think really helped you. Once you know what works for you, I would highly encourage you to try and replicate that. I don't think there's value or valor in deliberately picking subjects that are going to set you up to struggle. I think when it comes to developing a very specific skill in your work, the best thing you can do is set yourself up for success. Then, as you no longer have to work on looseness or whatever it is that you're pursuing, it's going to be much easier for you to turn around and level that up to more challenging pieces. All right, and those are my 7 steps for creating looser brushwork and more expressive paintings. Do you struggle with staying loose, or have you found your own tips for making more interesting brushwork? Please share with us in the comments because I'm sure we would all love to hear and learn. And if you learned something new today or found this video helpful, please give it a like. And if you haven't already, subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any new videos. Until next time, please stay safe, take care of yourself, and I wish you very happy painting.